So welcome to the Michigan Military Technical Historical Society Museum COVID-19 shutdown virtual tours. This is the third installment of our Jeeps of Ford little exhibit we had going on. And so in front of us we have a 1942 Ford GPW. So Ford built, government contract, 80-inch wheelbase, Willis pattern. This is your standardized wartime Jeep that you were looking at. This particular vehicle was one of about 250,000 Jeeps built by the Ford Motor Company during World War II. It was delivered on April 15th, 1942, and based on the information that we have and some of the Jeep whisperers out there that have looked at our serial numbers, and we're about 99% sure this vehicle was assembled at the Ford Dallas assembly plant. I venture to say, Ford had the capability to produce a lot of parts, and I would say that a large number of the parts were probably made here in the Rouge facility, and then they were shipped out to, if I remember correctly, there were 7 different assembly plants run by Ford that were assembling the Jeeps during the war. Very few were assembled here in Michigan. A lot of the parts would have come from Michigan, and then they would have gone out to the assembly plants. So if you watched our Ford GP video, you will recognize a lot of the things that were on there. We have the toolboxes in the back, and we have the folding rear seat. The Ford GPW toolboxes have this pattern on the top. This indents. That's another one way to tell a Willis from a Ford. Fords have this pattern. Willis toolboxes are flat on top. You see that the Willis pattern did not have the parking brake on the floor. It's up here on the dash. It's that L-shaped lever sticking out of the dash. But other than that, the four-wheel drive levers are on the opposite side on this one than they were on the Ford GP. But other than that, it's really not that different. So we'll kind of walk around here and we'll look at. Let's take a look at the front end here. So here you can see that Willis Go Devil 134 cubic inch engine that was used in the standard wartime Jeep. This was a passenger car engine that was used by Willis prior to the war. It was a solid engine. It was a good performer. It definitely outperformed the other 2 prototypes. I would venture to say that if Ford had selected a better engine, then Ford probably would be more closely linked to the Jeep than the Willis Overland Company, became. This is the reason, originally the government wanted to go to Ford and give them the contract, but they wanted this engine, and Willis objected and sued them, and they won, and they ended up with the contract, but then they ended up not being able to produce enough Jeeps, so then they had to go back to Ford. The whole acquisition process for the Jeep was a convoluted mess, and it really was such a mess that they ended up commissioning a report in 1943 called the Rifkind Report, where the Quartermaster Corps went back and looked at the acquisition process and documented it, and I don't know if it's an interesting read. For me, it's interesting. I think most people would find it to be a great cure for insomnia. But if you're interested in Jeep history, it's a great thing to have. We have copies here in the gift shop, so if you want one, we can get you one in the mail, or when we reopen, you can come by and buy one in person. We tried to make this, when I restored this Jeep, I bought this Jeep in 2001, and I think I spent until about 2007 restoring it. We tried to make it as accurate as possible. It is a 1942 Jeep. This is a later engine, and I did drive this Jeep quite a lot when I first did it. One of the things, this Jeep of this vintage would have had a road draft tube on it. And then later in the war, they went to this PCV system. And yes, they did have PCV valves in World War II that did not come out in 1957 with emission standards, but that existed here. And one of the reasons they did this was for deep water fording. With the road draft tube that just kind of stuck out the bottom of the block, you could get water sucked up into the engine, and your PCV system closed it and allowed you to go into deeper water without having to, try and figure out ways to keep water from getting into your road draft tube. So this is a little bit later engine, and there's a couple, but we made an effort to be as accurate as possible. This would be more of a motor pool Jeep, so this is an early war Jeep that somewhere along the line got a new engine put in it. You got the grease gun up here underneath the hood, which would also not have been there on the 1942. This hood is, I believe, a 1943 hood. When we got this Jeep, it was quite the Jeep salad, and I spent a lot of time and effort trying to put it back, but I'm not a very rich person, so we had to make some concessions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we have, and we'll start here in the back, and we'll come back around to the front. This is what's called a script tub Jeep. It's got the Ford script on the back. That is correct for early 1942. About midway through 1942, the government went to the auto manufacturers, said, this is a war, not an advertising campaign. And they made, and it wasn't just Ford, the Willys Jeeps had Willys on the back. The Chevrolet G506s had the Chevrolet on the hood, and on the hood sides, and the GMCs had the GMC logos in the grille, and there's a couple, I'm sure there's other examples. But at least fiscal year 43, so October-ish of 42, they were told that had to come off. So through the summer of 1942, they began to disappear. But since this is in April of 42, it still has the script. We do have, so the government began to issue, what are called modification work orders, MWOs, because as we're using these vehicles in war, we start to learn things about them. And one of the things, these early Jeeps would not have had the connector here for the trailer lights. And they began to realize that a lot of Jeeps were pulling trailers, and so they created an MWO that added this. When we bought the Jeep, it already had the hole cut for it, so we went and put that back in. But originally, when it left the factory, it would not have had the trailer plug on it. And anybody who's been, into the military vehicle acquisition process know there is a learning curve when you send these vehicles off to war, and you realize, we forgot to put a plug for a trailer. You will notice this vehicle does not have the gas can, which I'm sure most of you are familiar if you've seen the wartime era pictures. There's always a gas can here. At this point in the production, the gas can was applied in the field. This vehicle did have the holes for the gas can, but it obscures the Ford script, and I wanted the Ford script to be visible, so I left the gas can off. But the gas can was added in the field later, and then they realized, everybody wants the gas can, so then it became, and once the script went away, it didn't matter. It became a standard production item. This vehicle has the 3-bolt spare tire carrier, which puts a lot of weight on this back panel, especially if you're driving off-road and you're bouncing around. You'll start to see these panels pull away here in the corners. And the first thing they did is they came up with a reinforcing plate that went in here, it bolted in and welded in, and supported that rear panel to try and keep that rear tire, and especially once you added the gas can on the back, the weight pulling back this way would really start to separate that rear panel. So the first thing they did is they added reinforcing gussets, which I do not have on this Jeep. I actually have a set that I found after I finished the restoration of this Jeep, and maybe one day I'll go back and add them in there. Later, what they did too is they went to a a 2-bolt spare tire carrier that had a little foot that went underneath there above the bumperette. So the weight of the tire actually rested on the frame, and the 2-bolt spare tire carrier had a round disc that went in it. So rather than putting the weight of the tire up here on the top of this body panel, it put the weight of the tire on the frame and kind of resolved some of those problems. So they learned, as they went, they learned a lot of things. One of the other items that would not have been on this Jeep when it left the factory was the blackout light. The blackout light, again, was a field-applied item, which on later Jeeps became a production item. This is an MWO blackout light. Useless Jeep trivia. For those of you who are interested, you see that this is what's called the tombstone blackout light guard. You can see the shape here is, it looks like a tombstone. We know that this Jeep, or I will make the assumption that this Jeep had the MWO blackout light because it already had the holes here in the fenders for the tombstone style guard. The production style blackout light guard narrows down here at the bottom, and these 2 bolt holes are closer together. And that's what was used later in production. So if you have an early Jeep and they had a field-applied blackout light, now again, this is based on the research that I've done and what I've talking to other people. So I may be wrong. I mean, I don't know everything 100%, but this would be correct for a field-applied blackout light, and a production blackout light would have a narrower, would pinch in. It's more of a horseshoe shape than a tombstone. So again, more useless Jeep trivia for you. One of the other things that tells you this is a Ford Jeep is this front crossmember up here. You can see that this is a stamped U channel. The Willis Jeeps used a tubular front crossmember. There's also one less crossmember in the frame on the Ford Jeeps underneath, right, directly ahead of the trailer hitch brace and behind the machine gun mount. So you had there was a machine gun mount on the frame, and if you put the gun in, you drill through the floor of the Jeep, and the plate below it already has the holes for the M31C gun mount. Ford eliminated the extra crossmember directly behind that. So Ford was always looking for ways to simplify things and eliminate things. And so that was one of their things, is they went with the stamped front crossmember and they deleted the second rear crossmember. So while we're talking about production simplification that was done by Ford, down here on the bottom, and if you go back and watch the GP video, the early Jeeps had these welded grills. This is the standard. This is what's called the slat grill for the Willis MB. So the first production Jeeps made by Willis had this grill in it, and it's fixture welded. And if you count it up, there's over 30 parts here in this grill. So Ford, when they got the contract and started producing the Jeep, they're like, this is a lot of work to make this. How can we make it simpler? So the Ford Jeeps Ford came up with that design. So we have one here. It's a study in production simplification, which is one of the things that Ford really excelled at. And what became the standard wartime Jeep grill, and that we all know and love and recognize, was designed by Ford. And as opposed to this one down here that had 30 plus parts, if you don't count the captured nuts and things up here along the top, if you just count major components, it's about 10. It has less than 10 parts, and then then it has some captured nuts that are welded onto the top around it, which increase your parts count. But you can see this one here, you'd have to make each one of those individual parts, bend it, put it in a fixture weld it, and then this one here, they were just stamping them out, and became this, the government's like, oh, that's a great idea, well, let's go with that. So the last of the World War II items in our Jeeps of Ford area is this ad, which we have kind of split in half here. This particular ad came out of September 11, 1943, Collier magazine. It was a 2-page ad. And it's interesting because the Jeep people believe this is the only major advertising campaign that was done by Ford that featured the Jeep. We were lucky enough to find this. This is actually one of the printing plates for that. So we have that down here on the bottom, and then we have the ad up here on top. But it definitely talks about the Jeep, the sweethearts of the AEF. But it also has this little feature over here that talks about the Ford GPA, which were all Fords. So, Ford definitely, they didn't, Willis, there's a lot of Willis ads from the war that feature the Jeep. This, as far as we know, is the only Ford ad that features the Jeep prominently. So there we have our 1942 Ford GPW. We'll swing over there, and there's our 1941 Ford GP. And so our next feature, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about this guy, the M151 family of Jeeps. So until then, everybody stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.